Welcome to The Strain Podcast, a Southgate Media Group production, where we talk all about Guillermo del Toro's new parasitic horror fantasy series, The Strain, that airs on Sunday nights on FX. I'm your host, Blair Knight Graves, the associate editor from ShareRatings.tv, and with me today is Kyle Tremblay, the editor-in-chief from ShareRatings.tv. You can find us on Twitter at BlairLovesTV, and remember, that's Blair with an E, and at KyleLovesTV. You can also follow this podcast's Twitter handle at TheStrainPod. Hi, Kyle. How you doing today?
Blair, I am looking for a party button to hit because, holy cow, we just watched an awesome episode of The Strain.
Oh my gosh, we did. And we were so excited about it that we decided we needed to record the podcast the night that the episode aired.
This was an emergency podcast recording. This was, the bat signal went up. I published my review literally 5 minutes ago. This is all happening. Because we need to talk about this episode of The Strain immediately.
Yes, we move much more quickly with recording our podcast than any government agency does with the entire apocalypse.
Yes, they're still convinced this is some kind of military malfunction.
Exactly. So today, Kyle and I are going to be discussing Season 1, Episode 8, called Creatures of the Night, which was...
Sorry, I'm standing.
Standing ovation.
Standing ovation.
This episode was written by Chuck Hogan, who also co-wrote the book series with Guillermo del Toro, and previously wrote one of our mutually enjoyed episodes, Gone Smooth, which was Season 1, Episode 3. So, Chuck Hogan sort of pulled out all the stops in this episode.
I have to say, I had, not on the podcast, not even to you, but just sort of in my own mind, kind of been blaming Chuck Hogan for the shortcomings of The Strain, based on nothing whatsoever, except that I have this sense that I like Guillermo del Toro and didn't want to blame him. And since it's their book, it's one of their faults. So I've been kind of blaming Chuck Hogan. But this episode makes it impossible to blame Chuck Hogan because clearly he's doing something right.
Yes, absolutely. I would totally agree with you. You know, there's certain parts of me that have always wondered about that as well. Also, I never spoke about it literally to anybody. Mm-hmm. But being such a Guillermo del Toro super fan, I've never wanted to allocate the blame anywhere but the only other possible member of the team.
Yes.
But I think that we learned an important lesson with that thought with Creatures of the Night.
Chuck Hogan is a hero.
Yes.
Yeah. This was a phenomenal episode. Just a different level than anything else we've seen on The Strain, in terms of everything. In terms of horror, in terms of pace, in terms of characters. This was the version of The Strain that I hoped The Strain would be before a single episode aired.
And this was the episode of The Strain that I think most reflects what I enjoyed about the books. Again, for our listeners who are new to the podcast.
Classic disclaimer.
The only difference between Kyle and I is that I have read the books and Kyle has not.
Yep.
And I always must also add the disclaimer that I'm not asking for it to be a verbatim telling of the books because I don't think that any media can be translated from one to the next. Mm-hmm. That being said, I have complained quite a bit on this podcast that there's plenty of excellent material in the books that is being overlooked for very bad material in the TV show.
Yes, that the quality of the television show is not living up to the quality of the books.
Yes, exactly. And, in particular, I was not excited about last week's episode, For Services Rendered, which was episode 7. But in last week's podcast, Kyle and I were complaining that The Strain had just flat out refused to have a bottle episode, and then here we go.
Well, and I specifically brought that up thinking there was no way they would do one this early. That's normally something you do in like season 3, but that The Strain was begging for a bottle episode. That we had gotten so far down this rabbit hole with F and Nora and Abe, and just the whole perspective of the show was so warped from what it felt like it should be, that it seemed like we just needed a reset. We needed to get away from this A to B to C story, where every episode they basically go on a little quest that occupies the majority of the episode. And The Strain really needed to figure out a way to make it so that the only life the show had was when Icarus was on screen, because that can only last you for so long. And so just all signs were pointing to, if this series was going to swim and not sink, it needed a change of pace. It needed to be experimental, which is what Guillermo del Toro is famous for, being
Yes.
experimental, at least visually. I was skeptical that the show was willing, considering how big of a bet FX placed on this series. I didn't know if it would be willing to be experimental structurally.
Hmm.
And so, what is so delightful about this episode is that it was exactly that. It was a pure bottle episode, takes place largely in one set, um, and doesn't have anything to do directly with the worldwide events. And so
Hmm.
the scope is limited to this one convenience store, our main characters trying to escape, and that's the episode. And it just worked. It worked
It,
on every level, and it worked beautifully.
yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I don't know. It's interesting that you use the word experimental. I don't know that that's the word that I would attribute to this episode, because I felt that this episode was the most uniform, linear, and
Yes,
the most narrative story that we've had thus far.
that's true,
Like
but
straightforward narrative. And I always attribute experimental, obviously, to being outside of linear narration.
but
Uh,
but that in the context of the strain is experimental because this
that's true.
show has been bouncing around from plot point to plot point. It's like we follow F and Abe to a house, and then we go and we have some other like nonsense scenes, and then we follow F and Abe to another house. It's like that's every episode, and it's like the stories themselves are linear, but they're just all jumbled up in each episode.
Yeah.
And so this episode to just be one story, like it felt like a Breaking Bad episode,
Hmm.
just where there's this through line, like the hallmark of Breaking Bad, and one of the many things that made that series so excellent is that the episodes, if you storyboarded the episodes out, it is just a line. It is a straight down line, and you start somewhere and you end somewhere, and that's every episode of Breaking Bad. That's the show only ever told one story, and I think that gets overlooked when people are talking about that series in how revolutionary it was, because no other show does that.
Hmm.
This episode was that. This was one story told across an hour, and it in doing that, in making that I assume temporary switch, all the problems that the series has had that I've been complaining about and you started to complain about last week were rendered irrelevant.
Yep.
That it self-corrected those problems not by becoming a better show, but by adjusting the structure of the show so that those problems no longer mattered.
Yes. And I think you said it quite well in your review. Kyle is the editor in chief of TV, and he writes reviews about the strain every week.
Yep.
Um,
Just posted.
in it just posted. I posted 5 minutes ago. I
Yep.
read it in two, and then we started the podcast.
That's it. It's our
Uh,
night.
but you said, what did you say in your review at the very? Like, you're certainly not willing to say that the series has fixed itself completely. Like,
No.
you can't make that claim after one episode. But it did make me think that one of the, we've talked about this before, that freshman series often just struggle with finding their footing at the beginning. And that could be sort of what was going on with the strain, and this could be a sign of things to come. This also could be a huge anomaly.
Yes.
This could be a powerhouse episode written by Chuck Hogan that we're never going to see again. But based on the things that I've liked about the strain and the things that I like about this story, which is why I really, really enjoyed the book series, is that it gets really scary and it gets very intimate. And I
Yes.
think that I'm hoping that this was a sign of things to come.
I hope so too, but I mean the fact that it's a bottle episode, they're obviously not going to do that every week, is problematic going forward. Just because this isn't going to be the format of the show. I'm sure next week they get back to what they've been doing for the first 7 episodes as opposed to this episode. So I'm a little bit skeptical in that regard. But back to what you said first, which is, I don't think this episode did anything better than the previous ones in terms of all the things I've been complaining about.
Okay.
Like, we still had Nora, um, behaving poorly in life or death situations.
Yes.
We still had side characters like the convenience store clerk who appear to be refusing to acknowledge that there are killer vampires, even though they're staring directly at them.
Hmm.
You know, we still had the sort of stupidity of the side characters and of the people who occupy this world, and like none of that was any better than it's been. It's just that when the hour is so packed with tension and when it's so scary and when our heroes always have something urgent to do, all of that stuff just gets swept under the rug. There's no air left for that to live off of. Like all
Hmm.
those concerns just come and go because you're on to the next scene and vampires are attacking. You know,
Hmm.
and I've praised the Strain's pacing in the past, but this was a different level of pacing.
Hmm.
This was horror movie pacing. Like this was the climactic sequence in a horror movie, but it lasted an hour. And
Yeah.
that's what was so cool is that they were able to sustain it, and it really told a contained story, you know, as which is why it's a bottle episode, and that story from start to finish was so intense and so limited in scope, which I think is the key point, you know, that none of the worldwide concerns that we've been having ever entered into it.
Yes, but I think also one of the reasons that it was so successful was that even though we've sort of sloppily met all these characters, and there are, plenty of complaints that I have about all of them, um, ultimately the episode succeeded because there were all of these characters that you have grown to care about to a degree who are now put in this situation. And that's one of the things that a good horror movie does. A bad horror movie doesn't allow you to care about your characters at all. A bad horror movie is filled with Noras. I don't care about Nora. A good horror movie is filled with Jim Kents and Vass Fetts
Hold,
and Abe Satrakian.
hold on. We are not going to besmirch the name of Vasily Fett by putting him in anyone else's category.
That's true.
We need to talk about Vass.
My favorite character.
This was in my review I compared him to Nicolas Cage in The Rock. He was a full-on action movie star in this episode. He was delivering one-liners. He was shooting dudes in the head when nobody else would. He was killing vampires. He was making jokes in the midst of being attacked by vampires when he has to operate the gas station machine and he still has time to make credit card jokes and then like charge F's credit card with premium gas. Like this was a top to bottom powerhouse performance by Vass.
Yes.
Um, and it was sort of like his breakout party because finally he's relevant to the story of this series. Like he's just been existing on the fringes, and his scenes have been good, but it's like it's part of the problem where the show doesn't really have any focus. And now suddenly he meets all of our main characters, and it's like everything clicks. Like this group finally has a hero in it,
Yes.
and
And it's
that's
not the hero you'd expect.
yes, right. And Vass occupying that space that you would think that you would think F would fill, but he doesn't. And you don't really want to root for F. And Abe is such the like Obi-Wan Kenobi figure that you don't really root for him. You don't even think of him as a person really. He's just this sort of walking exposition machine that also chops off vampires' heads.
Yes.
Vass is that. He's the exterminator who we know is like a genius, but chose to just go into pest control, and now he's the one taking flying leaps and running and whacking vampires with steel pipes, and he's the one, you know, who has to make the tough calls, and it's like, oh, the show has a hero, and now it all works. Like
Hmm.
all the entire cast dynamic works now that the show has a hero. It's now F is free to be the sort of obnoxious genius guy off to the side because we have the action hero. F doesn't
Yes.
need to be the action hero, and that was such a revelation in this episode. Just how well Vass fits in with this group and how much the previous episodes were missing him.
Yes, and it's so fascinating because it wasn't even until everything that you just mentioned, like that it occurred to me that like I always knew that in the book series, Fett is my favorite character, absolutely my favorite character. He is the guy who gets stuff done. That's what he does. But in the TV show, But so in the books, F is sort of a bumbling idiot, and he just sort of bumbles through everything until he meets Fett, and then Fett sort of fills that role. But in the TV show, they sort of failed to make F be that sort of bumbling idiot character because they wanted him to be more of, the archetypical middle-aged
Yes.
hero. Like they wanted the story to be about F, and they wanted him to have more to do. So when you get these moments where he's sort of bumbling and sort of being silly and sort of being awful, you also have moments where he's supposed to be giving speeches about this is what we're supposed to do, when that's really not the character that he was initially portrayed as.
Right.
And so you're right, it doesn't make any sense, and it's so weird because it didn't quite click for me. But that's one of the reasons I wasn't liking F, is because they were trying to make him into a hero, and they were
Yes.
trying to make him sustain that sort of physical action in a way that character, not that Corey Stoll the actor isn't capable of, but that character isn't capable of. Because as you could see in the climactic moment of the episode, the climactic scene where they had to make a life or death decision for one of their party members, you see the thing about F that I love about his character, and which is also his biggest weakness, which is that he's refusing to believe that the world is becoming what it is, and he's relying too heavily on science and his belief that science works to put himself in the scope of the situation that he's actually in, and to live in the real moment, because he believes that there is a cure and that there is an answer. And so you're right, though. That's why it's such a revelation to have Fett finally join the team.
Yes, absolutely, 100%. I
Yeah.
think you've we're on the same page on this, and yeah, it's that F was being spread too thin. That he was having to fill all these roles in the team. He had to be the skeptic, and he had to be the hero, and he had to be like the guy who carries the action sequences. The guy you turn to when you need someone to kill a vampire, and Abe can't do it because he's old. Like, it just bringing Vass onto the team to take half those duties away from him, from F, it just makes the whole thing make sense.
Yeah.
It all makes sense now. The entire dynamic, and now F is free to be the sort of skeptical, sciency, nerdy guy, and we can root for Vass.
Well, yeah, and part of it is that I hope it's clear now that they're building a team. They're building this team of heroes that are like going to come together, but each of them have to have their own strengths. So to say that he was stretched thin is absolutely correct, and that's sort of the issue they've also been having with Nora, though, is that they stretched F too thin to make him a little bit more action hero-y, and then it's sort of you lose balance with her character because she's still trying to be
Yes.
on the analytical side, and he's supposed
Right.
to be her support, but he can't because he's not given that
Yes.
that characterization.
What they can't do is place F and Nora on opposite side of things.
No.
Because the audience is going to be side with F, because the show wants to side with F, which means Nora is the bad guy. Which,
Right.
since I just brought up Breaking Bad 2 minutes ago, is the Skylar White issue. Which is that if the show is leading you towards rooting for someone, and a female is constantly put in opposition to that person, then we're going to hate the female character. And that's what's happened to Nora these first few episodes. When she had, it doesn't help that the show hasn't really shown the nuance in her reactions to things. Like, it could have done better just to sort of give her perspective better, but even still, the fact that F isn't freaking out and Nora is instantly going to show Nora in a bad light.
Yes.
And so, adding Vass to the team as someone, like we just saw at this episode, when spoiler alert, Jim Kent needs to get got, in the Wire terminology, he needs to be killed, and Abe knows it, but F and Nora are in denial, and they're for once in denial together. And suddenly that point of view feels like it carries more weight. It's no longer the weak woman being the one who isn't willing to do what's necessary. Now it's the main character of the show who joins her, who isn't willing to do what's necessary. And suddenly Nora in that scene doesn't appear to be as weak as she has in the past, because F is on her side. Because then you could bring in Vass to just coldly shoot him in the head.
Right.
Because then Vass can be the hero. And so now that's balance. Now we have Abe and Vass as the sort of two that just do what needs to be done, and F and Nora as the two scientists who still have hope for the previous way of life, for living by the old world's rules. And that makes their point of view feel more valid. You know, the point of view Nora was expressing in the previous episodes didn't feel valid because it was so clearly wrong, and there was no one to back her up. And
Right.
so she was just on an island, and now she's joined by F, and suddenly it actually feels like a debate. Whether, you know, even though we know what's right ultimately, at least we can understand why they were not willing to kill their friend, you know, and we still cheer when Vass does it because, I mean, obviously it has to be done, but at least we get it,
Mhm.
when in the past we didn't really get it. And so the addition of Vass just made everything work in this episode.
Yes. Well, and I think he got paired with Abe a lot, and I think it
Yeah.
it it gives a lot of good opportunity because in previous episodes we saw F fail at physical things. He tried to take on the action hero role, and now everything's sort of coming together and making a lot more sense,
Yeah.
and I'm enjoying the
Well,
previous episodes more. But like F being unable to shoot more than once in last week's episode and only hitting Icarus in the leg. Now, when you think about it contextually, given what he did in this episode, we've talked about the strain struggling to sort of have consistency, but that he struggles with these physical acts. Even when he had to kill the pilot, a couple episodes back, I think in Gone Smooth actually,
yeah.
he really really struggled with that, and that was really really painful for him. Now, and Abe's been trying to tell him, do this, do this. This is what must be done. This is what's required. Now you give Abe you give him somebody who's physically capable of carrying out the tasks that need to be done, and
Yes.
that's going to be Fett. And that again, you have the Sage, you've got Abe, who is able to say, guys, this is what we need to do, and I'm the one who knows, but I am not physically capable of
Mm.
acting. You've got the right hand man of Abe, and then you've got the scientists who are going to try to think through everything and move through the world in that way. And and then of course now we have Dutch Velders for some reason.
Oh, oh, this is.
Oh,
I described this episode as tighter than Dutch Velder's pants.
yes.
Be- because, and that's another like thing where it's like the strain didn't, like, the specifics didn't improve. It's that they got the format right in this episode.
Right.
The fact that Dutch Velders was introduced and somehow just happened to be at the convenience store when this all happens. What is Dutch Velders doing at a convenience store, by the way? She's like the world's greatest hacker. But
She's at a convenience store in what I think is probably a bad neighborhood.
looks like a bad
Uh,
neighborhood, and
yeah,
she is unaware of all this that is happening around her. So
right.
even the world's greatest hacker doesn't realize the vampires outside until they show up right at the convenience store door.
Yeah, which, as you said, with I think was it Hassan? Was that the name
Yeah,
of the guy, the convenience store?
Hassan.
Like just the world continuing to just fail completely
Yeah,
with characters that are not our core characters. Like Vass figures it out on his own.
right, right off.
This is his first time actually
Yeah,
going, oh, they're vampires. Uh,
yeah.
he's figured out something. He's introduced at the very beginning of the episode. He says, "Say something, or I'm going to kill you."
He
He's
figured out the UV light thing before F did.
yeah,
He was there first, going for the same plan.
yeah.
He
He
beat
had
F to
the
it.
yeah. He is probably as smart as F. But it's like for some reason Vass has figured this out, and this is like something that totally just baffles my mind because I know it's the convenience of getting his character to the group, but Dutch Velders, you would think if she was going to be added, and I'm sure that this is a decision that they made after they had her scene where she was the hacker, where they decided to add her.
Yeah.
But you'd think that you would get more of her and her friend walking around, just something of some of them in the world. Like
Yeah.
any other characters in the world having all of this happen around them. It's just mind-boggling.
Yes.
And like this episode had the fortune of opening up directly after the last episode ended, so like we could figure out exactly where we were in the timeline.
Mhm.
But most episodes have not ended and started in that way, so you don't know like I can't tell you. I've watched every episode at least 3 times, except tonight I only watched this episode twice. I will certainly watch it 3 times before next
Mhm.
week, but like uh, I can't tell where the rest of the episodes lie in the gestation period, which Abe was finally able to kind of detail for us
Yeah.
in this week's episode, which is great. But like I don't understand why the world isn't freaking out yet. But like the
Yeah.
great thing about this bottle episode, even though we had the problems of like, oh, okay, now we've got Dutch tagging along,
Yeah.
and we had Hassan, the convenience store
Really
guy,
worried about
who's
shoplifting.
really worried about shoplifting. But then other than that, we kind of saw the stakes of, even what happens when there's just, what was it, like 20 vampires against a couple of
Yes.
humans. And it was terrifying. As you said before, it was like the climactic scene of a horror movie, but it sustained itself for an entire hour, and that really is impressive.
Yes.
But you're right, though. All the problems from last week's episode still remained.
Well, it has to do with the scope. Like
Yeah.
what's so funny, and what the show figured out this week, and whether by on purpose or by accident remains to be seen. Hopefully this was a revelation for the show as much as it was for us. Like hopefully the show finished this episode and said, "Oh my gosh, we know what we're doing now." Hopefully, and made some
Yeah.
adjustments based on the success, the creative success of this episode. But what worked so well is I said in last week's podcast that the show, it needs a bottle episode, and B, that it could really use from having a worldwide scope. But the inverse of that is true, which is that the show could also benefit from having a microscopic scope, through which we see the worldwide events. Like, the problem with the previous episodes is the scope has been in between. It's been large enough to where it makes us curious about the world at large and makes us have all these questions about the public and what they understand and why they aren't reacting and why the cops are arresting Gus and all those myriad of issues. But it hasn't been large enough to include answers to those.
Right.
We didn't see Dutch Velders in previous episodes living with the aftermath of her decision and learning about the vampires and coming to terms with the fact that she is part of this. And we didn't see any of the reaction to all these events. But when you cut the scope down so drastically, suddenly we're not asking those questions anymore. Suddenly and the answers that are provided are, we can extrapolate because it's all we know. And so when we see, in other words, they could have explained to us, they could have shown us the terror of the vampires in two ways. Either by having, like, what we were talking about for the eclipse, which we thought was coming, like a large-scale New York is taken over kind of scene. Like a Lord of the Rings style battle. Where the vampires just swarm the city. They exit the sewers and there's CGI and it's gnarly and they just kill the city on such a large scale. Or you could do it like this, on the smallest possible scale, to where we can extrapolate. We saw the terror of the vampires as they surrounded that convenience store and broke in, and we saw them using tools, and we saw how scary they are. And that accomplished the same thing, which is to make us scared of the vampires.
Yes.
And
in the most intimate way.
Yes, in this case it was intimate, and they could have just as easily, not just as easily because it would have been a lot more expensive and quite possibly less effective, shown us a large-scale, very impressive, like Game of Thrones North of the Wall style from this last season, like big CGI episode. But instead we get a little bottle episode that accomplishes the same thing, which is, we're scared of the vampires now, and we sort of understand how they attack and how sinister they are, and that they're not zombies, that they do have a degree of logic because the Master is able to see through all their eyes, as Abe, Captain Exposition, helpfully explained. That there's a degree of intelligence here, and like siege tactics, and that was so interesting and so scary, and so now we like understand how the vampires are going to attack the city.
Yes.
And we did that because we put it on the smallest scale possible, just on our main characters. That's all that matters in this convenience store, and that's it, and that's all we needed to see. And then we're able to understand the vampires now, and so that's was one of this episode's biggest triumphs, is for once getting the scope right.
Yes, and I think that it also was the smartest episode.
Certainly.
In
By
many
default.
ways, but by default. But it was the smartest episode in that not only did it take us to that small scale, and did it, have all of the Captain Exposition scenes where Abe was able to tell us a lot of things that we need to know, like the gestation period and the fact that they have a little bit of a hive mind thing going on, all that stuff. But we also, and this is why I use the word intimate, we lost a character that, even though he was to a high degree awful a lot of the time, had a meaningful impact on the story as a whole. And I think that had a meaningful impact on the audience not just the characters, but on the audience as well. Because I know that I, characters die in television series all the time. There are all kinds of things that have happened on Game of Thrones where I haven't really felt it that much just because I haven't, like, either the scene didn't pull it off for me or I didn't care as much about the character maybe as I should have. But this moment, this very tense moment where Jim Kent is killed by Vass because through one worm he was infected within the hour,
Yes.
full scale, all over his body. Like, there was something, it was powerful. And we were talking about the structure of this show. Structurally, everything ramping up to that moment after, they cut up in his face to get a worm out and they think that they fixed him. Like, how, that sort of red herring almost. And then just how quickly it escalated and how quickly that whole situation devolved into,
Yes.
all right, this is the only decision that we can make. It was chilling. Like,
Mhm.
I got goosebumps. It was really well done.
Yeah, that whole sequence is, I think, you have identified that the sequence of uh, Jim Kent gets a scratch on his face from one of the stingers. They discover a worm is in his face. They operate to remove the worm. F and Nora successfully remove the worm, and then a little bit later, we notice that he's infested with worms, and then Vass has to kill him. That's, I think, the best sub story that the strain has done to date.
Mhm.
Because it established a few things. It's the first time that the show has really established F and to a lesser degree Nora as competent, because they are able to think fast, sort of set up a impromptu operating table and remove the worm. Like, they accomplished what they set out to do in a way that a common person would not have been able to do it. And so I appreciated them actually making F like a sort of someone who's good at his job for once, to do that. And then if it would have just been left at that, if Jim Kent would have just kept on going and not died this episode, that would have undercut the how scary the vampires are, because like they were talking about, like, this wasn't a cure but it is a workaround. And so if they could just scoop out the worm from anyone who got it, then suddenly the vampires are a lot less scary. And so having the reveal that, oh no, removing one worm does nothing, that it was in his blood and now he's done and he's filled with worms, that reestablishes the how scary the vampires are and how immediate this threat of the virus is. And so, but it doesn't undermine anything about F and Nora, because how were they supposed to know that? So
Right.
the show for once was able to have its cake and eat it too, where it didn't portray F and Nora as dummies, but it also didn't mess with how scary its villains are.
Hmm.
And so that story really accomplished everything. And then, of course, the cherry on top was Vass just suddenly blowing Chipkin's head off, and then as he's laying dead on the ground, shooting him some more, just
Yeah.
because he's a freaking action hero.
Well, and it also taught, I mean, there's always these moments that heroes have to go through in any hero story. F not being an action hero, but being a hero nonetheless of the story. Um, these moments where they become hardened and they have to lose the sidekick. Like, that's a huge, like, that's never mind. That's part of the whole Campbellian way of thinking. But they have to, and it teaches them a harsh lesson. And at the end, I actually, it's a short moment, but there's the moment at the very, very end where F shoots the convenience store cleaner who ran out in the middle of the episode,
Yes.
for trying, thinking that he could survive, and did not survive. He sees the guy hasn't died yet but is writhing on the floor in pain, and makes that hardened decision to shoot the guy in the head so that he's not going to come back as a vampire, and to put him out of his misery, something that he was not able to do for his friend. And although that sequence maybe is 20 seconds or less, upon my rewatch of the episode, I thought that was also incredibly effective and incredibly chilling.
Yeah.
Because in a very short period of time, our heroes have learned a very important lesson, that they are not going to have to, they're not going to be able to stop and mourn. They're just going to have to learn from learn about what happened to their friend, learn from what happened to their friend.
Yes. Right. And it was a little bit of character growth. Now, you could make the case that he made the same decision with the FBI agent a few episodes back. more or
Hmm.
less,
Yeah,
um, where he had to sort of let him die. Um,
but
he
he
could-
let him die. He didn't put him out.
no, he didn't shoot him. Right?
He walked away.
Yeah, he didn't attempt to save him. So I guess you could say that this is sort of a progression um, towards becoming as ruthless as is required to operate in this world. Um, yeah, I mean I appreciated that. I appreciate the little arc that F had this episode, and in terms of his understanding. And Nora had the same thing, where she actually after much convincing and a few prayers, she actually started shooting at the vampires. So at least Nora's tagging along still, like she's not just a conscientious objector sitting on the sideline. She's getting involved.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I just thought the character work with the central characters in this episode, from top to bottom, was by miles and miles the best that the series has done to date. Like, it was the first time that the characters really made sense and really fit together.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I this is what yeah, ha, every single episode of this podcast, if you've been a long time listener,
Oh,
I have told Kyle it's gonna happen next week. It's gonna happen next week. Don't worry, it's gonna happen. It's finally gonna happen. And this is the week that it happened. And I feel like it was worth putting up with the ups and downs, the highs and the lows of the previous episodes. Because it led all to this moment. And I mean, we talked about this before, that they still have the problems that they have,
yeah.
but it was all worth it to get.
This was a great episode. A great
Yeah.
episode of TV. I rated it in my review, which you can read on showratings.tv, and add your own review, please. Um, I rated this a 9.5, which is very high. And to put it in context, the sort of average rating that I would give to like an episode of like Mad Men or Breaking Bad. Um, for like an average episode of those shows. So I'm saying that for 1 week, the strain sort of transcended itself to be on a different level of show. And it didn't do that by suddenly having great dialogue or suddenly having really complex themes and doing all kinds of things that it hasn't done at all to date. It just did that by being an awesome horror movie, and
Well,
and that's what I want.
yeah, and by being being an awesome horror movie, but being structurally sound, and depending
That's
on
what
all
an
the
awesome horror
information.
movie is.
That's true, but depending on all of the information that we learned before, and doing something great with it. And yeah, no,
Yeah,
you're right.
no, I mean, we got here in a winding, clunky, rocky path, but we did get here, and obviously they couldn't have led with this episode. So,
Right.
so to a degree, it builds on what came before. But at the same time, it is a bottle episode. In that the concept is that it exists outside, largely outside of the narrative of the season. And so, again, I'm going to be fascinated what next week is like, because I sincerely hope that this is the turning point and not a detour on the road that we were headed on.
Right.
That's I think in the next couple of weeks we're going to figure out whether this is the first of the better version of the strain, or whether this is just a nice surprise, which, according to my point of view, is what happened with The Walking Dead, the episode that I referenced last week, which I believe was called Home in season 3, which was a like this, an episode out of a much, much better show. But then The Walking Dead immediately went back to being the show that it always was. And so I'm going to be really interested if the strain next week is just like it's been in previous weeks, if we just move on, which is entirely possible and very much in line with the bottle episode mentality, or if we're going to notice that if we're going to keep that tight focus, which I think is the key thing. Like, it doesn't have to, like, all the episodes don't have to be bottles and that we're at the same set the entire time. We can still move around and we can still have B stories and C stories, but it's that focus on the A story. It's that, that this episode has a point to it. I mean, I think that it would have been a shame, but it wouldn't have ruined this episode if we would have had like 2 or 3 Iker scenes or something. You know,
Mhm.
like we could have gotten away with this not being a straight ahead bottle episode, and the show still could have told like a small B story and maybe even a small C story, and it still could
Mhm.
have had a similar effect. So that's kind of what I'm hoping the show is from now on. That it's just tighter, that we have a clear sense of what's happening, that the horror and the urgency, very importantly, the urgency is still there, and that, so that even when it's not just set at a convenience store, we still have this sort of vibe. Because the vibe of this episode was so tense and so urgent, which is so different than the previous episodes.
Do you feel, because I think I expressed this a little bit earlier, but do you feel that in a lot of ways you've figured the characters as they were written and performed before
Hmm.
are making a lot more sense now with this episode? Like there's a like this is a settling, like it feels like this is a settling in moment, because I was talking about how I got through the context, as you said, of like F and Nora being on the same page,
Right.
and seeing Vass be able to take over the physical moments and
Hmm.
being able to be the action hero. I feel a lot better right now in this very moment, the night of the episode. I haven't obviously had a whole day to process,
Yes.
but right now I feel a lot better about the episodes prior. I feel like I have like there is just like something about F that, even though I've read the books and I had the context, that I just totally was not able to pick up on or get through until this episode, and now everything about him makes sense to me as he was before. I
I
don't do you,
I'm not sure if I'm willing to give the show retroactive credit.
okay.
I think, as we said earlier, they were really trying to fill the action stuff with F in earlier episodes, and I don't know how much of that was intentionally bad. As like we can rewrite history. We can be a little revisionist here and say that those action sequences with F were intentionally bad so that we would appreciate Vass's arrival finally, and that's certainly how it played out. I'm not willing to give the show credit for doing that intentionally. I, I
Okay.
think I think the show was trying to get by with F as an action hero and as a placeholder for Vass, and also as the sort of moral center of the show, and as you know, like we said, they were trying to get by with F playing every role, and again, hopefully this will clarify things in the future. And now that Vass is involved, we're not going to go back to that. But I don't think the show was. I think the show could have done a lot of things to better give a sense that the show knew that F was unqualified for the roles he was performing. I think there would have been a way to indicate that, that the show didn't do, and so I think I still hold to my analysis of the previous episodes. I don't think this knowledge
Yeah.
changes my opinion of them. It just finally works now. So going
Yeah.
forward now, it's where I'm going to change my opinion if this is held to.
Right. I think I'm sort of going back and forth on that a little bit right now, just in my head. Because you're certainly right. Like they could have shown him, like, drop a sword that he couldn't hold properly, or, misfire a gun, or like he's still like it's the thing I'm most analyzing is last week's, like you and I bickered over this a lot in last week's podcast, where he shot Icorst in the leg and then let Icorst sort of run away.
Yeah.
And I suddenly, like, he had a look of shock on his face, but I don't know that it was necessarily like held on him long enough, like the way that
Yes.
I think that was supposed to be the bumbling idiot moment that I didn't make that connect.
Yeah.
And it's weird, again, because I have the context of the books that I should have made that connect. But I hadn't made that connect until this episode, until he could not shoot his friend, which obviously is a really hard thing to do.
Yes.
And Vass, just took over and fought everybody in a way that F couldn't, even when they went out at the beginning of the episode and tried to escape and failed and had to go back in. When Jim Kent initially got infected, like it's finally retroactively connecting for me, and I actually feel like it's it's an important thing to bring up, even if we don't need to discuss
Yeah.
it any further.
No, that Jim Kent moment is the key one, because the show finally allowed F to be wrong. And that's what I'm talking about when I say that it wasn't acknowledging him. F had never been wrong until that point. on the like in a way that the show, in terms of the show's judgment of him. There was never a point in which the show led the audience to conclude, like, oh, F is wrong here. I mean,
Mhm.
like, you could talk about, like, his custody hearing with his son, but then he also gets these big, meaty monologues to deliver about how much he loves his son. So he's not clearly wrong in that case, even though Zach the son is always right, obviously. But like, we got his perspective on that, and like, there was no point in which the show let F be just flat out wrong the way that it always let Nora be flat out wrong, and
Right.
that was the problem. That to me is what not acknowledging it means. Like, if you want your character to be portrayed as sort of in over his head, and not up for this, then he has to be allowed to be wrong. And this is the first time that the show allowed him to be wrong. And that's what Vass brings, is that Vass is going to be the character who's always right now. And so F doesn't have to be always right. And that's what this is. So now F is free to be, I think, the character that the show always intended him to be, but never fully committed to,
Yeah.
which is the character you're describing. And so again, hopefully going forward now, F's role on the show is adjusted thanks to Vass's presence, that he doesn't have to be the one who's right now.
So, do you feel like, obviously it was in large part because of the writing, but you and I are both truthers for Corey Stoll. We love him.
Love Corey Stoll.
Love Corey Stoll. But is this something that, as I said, I'm having these retroactive thoughts. Um, is this maybe a misread by him as an actor? Is that something worth analyzing?
It's,
That maybe he was trying to be like, I keep analogizing him to Dr. House, that type of character.
yeah.
Like that he was trying to be to Dr. House and not enough. I'm trying to think of another like Masters on Masters of Sex. Bill Masters. I don't.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, great comparison, by the
Right.
way.
Yeah. Bill Masters.
Really
is,
good.
like he's wrong a lot of the time, but he is your hero.
Yes.
And his is the story that you follow. And you read that from him because of the body language. Like Michael Sheen, I think that's the actor. Michael Sheen's body language. Like, he does an excellent job with the subtlety of that character. Did Corey Stoll try to go to Dr. House and not enough Bill Masters?
That's a really good point. And and as much as I love Corey Stoll, I see. I don't know if it was a choice. That's my only thing. I think that is certainly the effect that happened. That Corey Stoll was playing the part as a sort of as something different than what, because the character for the first time this episode really worked, and the way Corey Stoll's been playing the part is different than that. This was a different F in this episode, and it is a big reason why everything clicked into place. But Corey Stoll's charisma is very specific. He's not a leading man in the sort of traditional sense that you put him in a movie and he's the hero, like sort of like Tom Hanks playing Tom Hanks, or Brad Pitt playing Brad Pitt, like in World War Z. Brad Pitt's character name is Brad Pitt. You can't tell me otherwise. He's just playing Brad Pitt, or George Clooney in the Ocean's movies. He's playing George Clooney. Corey Stoll is, as we saw in House of Cards, is someone who is very adept at playing the sort of tortured guy who wants to do the right thing but has a lot of demons.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he brought that to this performance, but it's not quite that. Like, that's not the extent of what F is. Like, F, there's this, like you've been calling it, like, bumbling, this sort of bumbling thing to F that Corey Stoll doesn't play. Because Corey Stoll always comes off as very competent, even when he's a senator who has a major drug problem and is making terrible decisions. There's always this sort of, like, a twinkle in his eye, almost, where, like, you kind of get it. Like, he's always redeemable, in a way. That's just sort of what his charisma is. And I don't know if the way the part was written the first 7 episodes, if that was 100% in line with who he is as an actor. And I think this episode sort of, it just clicked into place, like I've been saying. Like, it freed him from having to be the hero,
Yeah.
and that sort of let the performance go in a more petulant direction. Which I, it's not that Corey Stoll can't play that. I think that his default mode is as the senator from House of Cards, and that's kind of how he was playing this part early on, because that's how he was asked to play it, but by the writing. And so this episode where he got to be wrong and he got to, he got to yell at Vass for doing the right thing, and there was just this. It just seemed to work better. I believed him in this episode. I believed that character more.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's tough to say. I mean, it's all I could say is that it worked in this episode.
I guess I keep going back. Like, one of the things that I was talking about before with Nora was I saw Nora as a competent character up until she saw, the child get beheaded, and then, things started changing for her character. And I'm trying to find these moments of like, when does an act, like, when are the actors making choices, and when is the writing making the choices for them? And I think certainly, like, Nora shows, I said before, she shows strength with her mother, and she showed strength in whenever it comes to her capabilities as a scientist, but then very weak physically, and the same thing obviously with F. So I guess I'm sort of thinking through that right now. We obviously haven't seen enough of Fett to talk about that with him, or
right.
Abe is sort of
Abe exists outside of the reality.
Yeah,
Abe is
he's
Yeah,
Gandalf.
he's Gandalf, right? He's a magician. He's he's someone who's just magically exists, and you just sort of accept it because that's how fantasy shows work. So
and then Icorst has been consistent throughout. So it was just
he's dark. He's Dark Abe.
Dark Abe. Exactly. But yeah, no, all in all, Creatures of the Night, fantastic episode.
Terrific.
If you haven't watched it, I'm sorry for all the spoilers, but you should definitely watch it.
Watch the episode.
And you should definitely talk to us about it. You should talk to us on Twitter, or you should write us fan mail at Southgate Media. Or no, wait, Southgate Media Group at gmail.com is one way to get a hold of us, or you can get a hold of us at the Strain Podcast at gmail.com.
Yes.
Before we go, is there anything else that you want to talk about, Kyle?
We got a really good email at the Strain Podcast email address.
Oh,
did you happen to see it?
I did not. For our audience, not that you need to necessarily know, my computer has been down this week.
Yeah.
I'm recording this podcast off of my phone.
I imagine it went down in some kind of struggle with vampires, right?
Exactly, yes. So why don't you go ahead and read the email? I would love to hear it.
Yeah. Well, I should say you spilled water on it. It wasn't.
Okay, we don't have to tell. We don't have to.
I think we do.
Not my fault.
The email is from Mark in Seattle, who you can find on Twitter at Bauschke. I know I said that wrong. At BAUSCHKE, who wrote us a very nice note. Saying he enjoyed the podcast and liked that we didn't take it too seriously. He did quibble with us saying that the eclipse didn't happen, because it very clearly did happen in that episode where the coroner was marauding the streets and killing people. That was certainly during the eclipse.
Occultation?
Yes,
was that the name of the episode?
Yes, and I agree. That's point well taken. The eclipse did happen. I think my issue with the eclipse was that it didn't end. We just started up the next day. Like there was no arc to the eclipse. We've been talking a lot about the arcs we liked in this episode. The eclipse didn't have an arc. It had one scene, and then it ended. It unceremoniously.
Yes.
So I think that was more the problem that we had, which is that it didn't feel like it went anywhere. Like the entire point of the eclipse was to get Gus arrested for under the stupidest of possible conditions. So
yes, and I've said this before, but in the books that's a huge part. There's a lot of time dedicated to the eclipse and how that affects the vampires sort of making their way on New York for the first time, and like lots of stories that have to do with the Master and Palmer and all that stuff. So there's a lot of backstory, and there's a lot of meaning to the eclipse that sort of just falls flat and is not there. And you're right, it is just meant to be an exercise in how can we get Gus and Felix into a jail cell.
And I can't think of a single narrative reason why the events of this episode couldn't have taken place during the eclipse or the subsequent night. You seems like you could have retrofitted. Like we didn't need to end the eclipse like just like have a hard cut away from the eclipse and never speak of it again. It could have,
Right. Well,
you could have rearranged some things and
right.
made this what happened during the eclipse, and then made the events of last week's episode happen the next week or whatever.
Right. And the importance of an eclipse is that it is what feels like nighttime during the daytime.
Yes. Right.
So,
Yes.
like when, at night, yeah, the vampires can be out, but maybe they're not getting everybody because everybody's indoors. But during the day, everybody's out.
Yes, and it just seemed. I mean, I have no real problem with stringing out the timeline like this. It just seemed like it was building towards something bigger happening. The eclipse seems like a great time for the apocalypse to start, especially with how much they built it up. And so it was just a little bit disappointing how minor it was. But at least we're getting the kind of material that we thought we were getting then now.
Yes, absolutely. And was there anything else that he said in the email, or was that pretty much?
Yeah, he liked he agreed with our rants about Gus and how ludicrous that all was, and yeah. So thank you for the feedback, Mark.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mark. And we encourage everybody to send us emails. If you have gripes with us, please let us know. If you agree with us, but you have a point that we didn't bring up, please let us know as well.
Every week I tell everyone, hey, if you like this episode, then tell me why, because I didn't. This week, if you didn't like this episode, tell me why, because I can't imagine anyone not loving this episode. It feels good to say that. I'm so happy to have a happy podcast for once. This has been getting darker.
Yeah, no, and I agree. Last week's podcast, for people who have been listening straight through, I sort of had a crisis of faith. I convinced Kyle a couple months ago to do this podcast with me. I convinced him to watch the TV show when he said that he probably wasn't going to because it was a vampire TV show and that's not really his thing.
Yes.
And I had like a sense of dread and guilt almost with last week's episode because, like, I understand, Kyle, you enjoyed the vampire ninjas, and I did too, to an extent.
Yes.
But just. Yeah, we covered it in last week's episode, but last week I was so dejected and crestfallen. You can read all of my tweets about how upset I was that I recorded a negative podcast about something that I really want to love, but was not loving. And this episode has given it some points for at least a couple episodes.
Yes, so, absolutely. This definitely bought it some time. Last week I had said that halfway through I was considering just not taking the show seriously anymore, like intellectually bailing on the show, and so now it's bought itself at least like 3 more episodes before I consider doing that again. So a winner of an episode.
Yes. And last week, there was something, I apologize to the person who tweeted at me. I don't have your Twitter handle in front of me right now because I am without technology, or I can only use my technology for one thing at a time right now. But somebody tweeted at me, in last week's episode, I was lamenting that there was a train sequence in the books that I was really excited for that didn't come. But in episode 11 of this season is called The Third Rail. So
probably.
Yes, and it's written by Chuck Hogan,
who
wrote this episode.
All right.
So that is, I think, the horror climax of the books, the very first book. That is the most horrific it gets. I was awake for 3 days after reading that chapter. So I'm very, very excited. 3 more episodes. I'm just all around. I am a very happy camper with the strain right now. So thank you. Yes, so thank you everybody who's been listening, and thank you for putting up with us last week. And if you agreed with us, that's good too.
You agreed with us both these last 2 weeks when we had very different takes on the episodes.
It's true. Very, very true. Before we close, I also want to give a quick shout out to the Masters Minions, which is the fan site that you should join on Facebook and Twitter. They are one of the biggest fan sites for the strain. They're really, really fun, cool people. So check them out. Is there any shout outs that you'd like to give? Would you like to shout out Show Readings TV? Always.
But we got to wrap this up. Kanye's about to go on stage at the Made in America Fest, and I have to watch. So let's wrap this up.
All right. Well, enjoy that. Okay. This wraps up our 9th episode of the Strain Podcast. Before we go, I want to mention a few things. You can download and subscribe to our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. You can also hear all of our podcasts at our website, southgatemediagroup.com. Please subscribe to this show and also rate us. Follow the show on Twitter at @TheStrainPod, and Kyle and I at KyleLovesTV and at BlairLovesTV. And remember, that's Blair with an E. Check out our website, showratings.tv, to rate and review The Strain every week, as well as all of your other favorite shows. Thank you again for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
If you would like to donate to help pay for this and other Southgate Media Group podcasts, simply go to our website, southgatemediagroup.com, and click on the donate button. It can be as little as $1 or, well, as much as you want. Help keep this fun going by supporting this and our other shows. Thanks again for listening, everyone. You're the best fans in the world.